Continuing learning the Shmona Prakim, and we looked at the translator's Hakdama, and then we looked briefly at the Rambam's own Hakdama to the Hakdama. And again, just to review it very, very quickly, you'll remember that the Rambam brings a Maimer Chazal from Maseches Bava Kama, that Haiman de boy lemahavi chasida. If a person wants to reach the madrega of chasidus, lekayem mile diavos, he should fulfill the words of Pirkei Avos, because they bring a person to the Maila of Chasidus. The Rambam then directs us to the famous Brisa of Rav Pinchas ben Yoir, which is the basis of the Mesilas Yesharim, about different levels lead to different things. And he points out that Chasidus, based on that listing, Mevia lidei Ruach HaKodesh. So, Avos brings you to Chasidus. Chasidus, in turn, brings you to Ruach HaKodesh, which the Rambam at this point is essentially equating to Nevuah. Now, technically, they are not synonymous, but for this purpose, the Rambam treats Ruach HaKodesh as a type of Nevuah, and Nevuah is considered to be the greatest level of Devekus, of cleaving to God, that is humanly possible, right? That's the idea of Nevuah. So the Rambam goes with the idea that by perfecting my midos, I become a chassid, and when I become a chassid, I am able to have nevuah and ruach hakodesh. Now that doesn't mean automatically; it depends on how much you've perfected yourself. But this goes back to the idea that I've already said, that the Rambam will also say later a number of times that midos ros, the analogy is, are a mechitza. They are a wall. They are something that separates your neshama from Hashem. You are unable to understand Hashem. You are unable to cleave to God as long as there is egotism and arrogance and selfishness and anger. And these midos ros are mechitzos. And as a result, by becoming a chassid, I remove these mechitzos. When I remove the mechitzos, I have a state of communion with the Almighty, which can be called Ruach HaKodesh, or Nevuah. Again, this goes back to the idea that the ultimate purpose of perfecting my midos is not that I therefore do more chesed in the world. It's the other way around. I do chesed so that my midos are perfected, so I commune to it, I connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the ultimate tachlis is considered to be that particular connection. The next point, I know I went over this, was the Rambam says, I'm going to draw on a lot of books and a lot of sources and a lot of scholars, Jewish and non-Jewish. I will not tell you from whom I am quoting people. And the Rambam gives an interesting reason, that although Chazal do say you're supposed to give credit b'shem amro, in the name of the person that said something, but the Rambam says, I'm going to do the opposite of that. It's a little schwer. How can the Rambam depart from the Gemara? Because if I give you sources from people that might not be Jewish or whatever, you might discount them and you will not evaluate them properly. Therefore, I'm going to give you the wisdom, the insight, without giving you the source. But the Rambam says, I'm not deceiving you because I've already told you ahead of time that I'll be drawing on different sources. This is the Rambam's general opinion, that the Rambam did not like to spend time giving exact sources for things. Now, the truth of the matter is, even in halacha, that was his approach. I mean, you'll recall that stylistically in the Mishnah Torah, which is the Rambam's compendium of halacha, the Rambam never gives you a source. The Rambam just gives you halachas. And what do the Mefarshim of the Rambam do? Starting with the Magid Mishnah and the Kesef Mishnah, what do? They try to show you the source in the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, the Tosefta, of where the Rambam got a particular halacha. And to this very day, there are places in which they say, we don't know where the Rambam got this particular halacha. Rav Chaim Kanevsky, Zichrono Livracha, actually wrote a sefer trying to supply sources for the Rambam where the classical Mefarshim did not give the sources. Sometimes there are midrashim that the Rambam had that we no longer have, and the like. Sometimes the Rambam may have made a diuk, meaning it wasn't always explicit in a sugya, but the Rambam made a certain inference which was the basis of a halacha. But even after Rav Chaim Kanievsky, there are still dark corners where we don't know exactly what the Rambam's makor was. In fact, we have tshuvos that the Rambam himself had difficulty finding something out. We have different questions that people ask the Rambam, and one of the questions was, the Rambam was asked, what is the source of this halacha that you said? It involved a law in Ritzicha. And the Rambam writes, I looked around in Makos and Sanhedrin, I looked around in all of the places that this would seem to be the place where the halacha is discussed, and the Rambam says, I couldn't find it. Finally, it was like a Tosefta in Kutchim. It was a real obscure, out-of-the-way place that the Rambam himself didn't remember where it was that he got it. It is said that the Rambam expressed regret that he didn't write a companion volume giving the sources for every halacha in the Mishnah Torah. But again, his idea was, I don't want to get you involved in an authority game. Because if I tell you, oh, this is Rabbi so-and-so, you'll say, Rabbi so-and-so, who listens to him? Or the other way around, the Rambam says. Rabbi so-and-so, oh, you're going to suspend your critical faculties. You're not going to think, Rabbi so-and-so, that's the end of it. Or, oh, it's a guy who listens to Goyim. So the Rambam says, I don't want you to get involved in authority. I want you to look at the chachma, look at the wisdom, take it in, and it makes no difference. I remember just, apropos of nothing, there was a great Talmid Chacham, very unusual person, Rav Gedalia Nadal, Zechreino Livracha, who lived in Bnei Brak. He was a Talmud of the Chazon Ish. He was a Chavrusa of Rav Chaim Kanievsky. He really was very up there. But he was an unusual person within the Haredi world. He was unusual, number one, because in spite of the fact that he could have been a Rosh Yeshiva anywhere, really anywhere, any yeshiva, any kollel, any level, he did not want to get money for learning Torah, so he actually had different businesses. He was a building contractor, he was a kabbalan, very unusual for a Talmid Chacham of that stature, not to be officially in the Torah world. He was also very unusual because he had certain ideas about age of the earth and about the creation story that are way out there that you would not think are from ideas. But he talked about the fact that Adam may not have been the first person, and days can be different lengths. All of the things that people say as matter of controversy. He, as a gadol b'Torah, actually said it, and he was unattackable. Meaning, someone like Slifkin or whatever it is says something, they can bomb him to smithereens. But Rav Nadal said something was not. He was basically unassailable because of his tremendous stature. But he would make a point when people would ask him a shaila, and they would say, how does this fit with the Pnei Yoshua? They would use a lot of names in their question. He says, let's not talk names, let's talk ideas, let's talk concepts. Don't try to bowl me over with this name and that name and that name and that name. He says, let's talk about the actual ideas. And that is exactly what the Rambam is saying here. It is very interesting, but again, I leave you with a little bit of a kasha that Chazal seem to have gone in the other direction when they say that you are supposed to say things b'shem omro, in the name of the person who told it to you. Remember the proof? Because when when Esther told Achashverosh of the assassination plot against Achashverosh, it says specifically, she said it in the name of Mordechai. And that actually turned out to be very good. That's why Mordechai was memorialized in the king's records, and Mordechai was therefore elevated to a high station. So from there we learn out you should say things b'shem amro. Yeah.
I'm wondering, does the Rambam bring that down halacha himself? Or is it, maybe it's like an Eitz HaTovah?
I have to check. That's a good point. Maybe the Rambam doesn't even paskin like that whole statement. Yeah. that is a very good point. But I would differentiate. I think the Rambam might answer that Shem Amra was referring to an objective fact. So an objective fact is just a fact. But when you're dealing with opinions, the Rambam says there's a certain maila in not Shem Amra, so you shouldn't get too fixated on who said it. Because the Rambam was a point of Kabel HaEmes. you should receive the emes from every source. Yeah.
How do we know Rambam couldn't be like making up some of these things? Like he could like be taking a quote and he could be like misphrasing what the original person was saying.
Yeah, you're right. That is a risk. You're right. If I don't document what if someone doesn't say where it is, you have no way of checking on it, right? So who says the Rambam is accurately describing it? But here's the counter argument. The counter argument is the Rambam says, I'm not presenting it to you as a quote. I'm presenting to you as an idea. So let's say I made it up. So what? Evaluate the idea. In other words, the Rambam's own logic says I don't have to tell you something. I don't have to be exact, right? So that's the whole point. Look at what I said. Is it right or is it wrong? Did I distort a quote? Maybe I did, right? But that makes no nafkamina. Now in halacha, though, I have to admit, in halacha that would be much more serious, because in halacha you're not simply giving your ideas. You're trying to represent what Chazal say. So I think you do have a good point, and indeed the Ravid asked it on the Rambam. The Ravid says, why should I accept his opinion of something if he doesn't tell me where he got it from? But in philosophy, it could be that it's actually less of an important point.
Before time compiled sources for the Rambam, why has the Rambam since that, before then, up until that point, been so commonly accepted?
No, let me clarify this. I didn't mean to say at all that Rav Chaim was the first one who compiled sources. Sources of the Rambam go all the way back to very shortly after the Rambam. The Magid Mishnah, the Kesef Mishnah, the Migdal Oz, all of the Meforshim on the Rambam go on giving sources. I was just making a point that even after hundreds of years of those sources, not every halacha in the Rambam had a source, so Rav Chaim filled in a lot of the gaps. He was not at all the first one. He was really more or less the last one. So there always were sources. And the reason the Rambam was accepted is because the Rambam was accepted, meaning to say people saw his greatness and the enormity of his stature, and Memela, he got accepted in that way. But we talked about this. There was a lot of controversy. The Ravid basically said, if you don't give me sources, I don't have to accept you, right? That's exactly what the Ravid said. Okay, so that takes us to the end of the Rambam. Yeah.
Sorry, just really quickly. The Rambam in the Mishnah Torah sort of gives psak halacha.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, it's seeming that he also puts this narrative towards us that like go and learn for yourself and find out what the halacha is on your own terms. Is that like sort of good?
Well, there's a certain schizophrenia here, meaning to say, on one hand, the Rambam says he wrote the Mishnah Torah for people who were not capable of going back to the Gemaras and extracting the halacha from Gemara. You learn Gemara, you understand how difficult it really is to figure out from a Gemara what the halacha should be. First of all, the Gemara itself doesn't tell you, usually, what the halacha is. And second of all, there are different ways of interpreting each opinion in the Gemara. And which opinion survives and which opinion is nitcha. Very, very complicated. So even if you were capable of learning Gemara, meaning a lot of people aren't even capable, even if you're capable of learning Gemara, you're not going to be able to figure out what the halacha would be. So the Rambam on one hand wanted to make it easier for people who were incapable, but the Rambam says for those who are capable, they do have to go back and look at the sources. So it was kind of a double standard for different types of people. Okay, so now we begin the Shmona Prakim proper, and the Shmona Prakim, as its name suggests, is 8 chapters, preparatory to Pirkei Avos itself, and each chapter, again, this was written in Arabic, remember, but we're going to work with the Hebrew translation of Rav Shmuel ibn Tiban. And chapter 1 is called, each chapter has its own little subtitle, B'nefesh ha'adam v'kochoseha. The meaning of the nefesh of a person, the soul of a person, v'kochoseha, and its powers or potentialities. So here the Rambam seems to be making a statement here that is not like the Mekubalim understand it, although you'd have to go into a deeper analysis. The Mekubalim, the Arizal, and really from the Zohar, talk about 5 different souls that a person has: the Nefesh, the Ruach, the Neshama, the Chaya, the Yechida. Right? 5 different levels of soul. The Rambam starts off very emphatically that there is only one soul. There are not many, many souls. There is one soul that is distinctively a human soul, but the soul has different capacities, different potentialities, different powers, different potentials. So because of that, people often talk about different types of souls, but that is simply a description based on powers and potentialities. But the soul of a human is a unitary entity. It's a life force that has several distinct components. And therefore the Rambam rejects the idea of a multiplicity of soul. We do not say there are many souls. There is only one soul. That is the breath that God breathed into the human being. He does say, however, that a human soul is a qualitatively different metzius than an animal soul, even though there will be an overlap in function. So, for example, a human soul, part of my soul may control my digestive system, and an animal also has part of its soul controlling its digestive system, but that does not mean we share the same digestive soul. There is a human soul, there is an animal soul, there will be an overlap of functions, but the functions are also going to be distinct. Yeah, I just began, yeah.
Is it not possible to say that, even according to Arizal, that there's really one soul, but there are different aspects of the soul?
It's possible, yeah. I mean, that's not the language of it, and it's not the way it's described. Yeah, it is possible, yeah. Okay, so now let's go over the enumeration that the Rambam gives us. The Rambam enumerates 5 Kochos HaNefesh. The first is called the Zun. The Zun literally means like Mazonos. Zun means the nutritive soul. And that is the soul that controls my physiological, biological processes, which is largely not in the realm of consciousness. Breathing, digestion, circulation of blood, heartbeat, the things that keep me biologically alive. Now, Aristotle talked about that as a separate soul, an animal soul, so to speak. In other words, under an Aristotelian analysis, the part of my soul that keeps me alive and keeps an animal alive is the same thing. Just human beings have other layers on top of it. The Rambam rejects that. Well, we'll see why that makes a difference with you a little later. The Rambam says no. There is one human soul, and one of the kochos of the human soul is that which is called zun, that which biologically keeps you going. That is the zun. The second koach of the nefesh, not the second nefesh, the second koach of the nefesh is margish. Now the word margish is simply a word that means feeling, but this refers to sensory input through the 5 senses that we have by which we can perceive external reality. So that includes the capacity of sight, eyes, ears, right? Seeing, hearing, smelling, touching. And what's the 5th one? I left that one? Tasting, right, taste. That's correct, right? So these are the 5 chushim and the 5 senses. And these are the ways that human beings, as well as animals, so this we share in common with animals, but it's a different soul. That's what he's saying, right? This is called the margish. So the zun and the margish are common to humans and animals, but not because we share the same soul and we have other layers on top of it. The souls are different, but the functions of zun and margish are going to be the same. And of course, in the case of animals, the margish of animals is often superior to that of human beings, right? I mean, many animals can see better, hear better, run better, right? A dog, for example, can certainly smell much better than a human being, right? So that's a separate issue, right? So that's the second faculty, the zun, the margish. Then the third faculty is called midame. Now midame, dimyon, is used to the word imagination, But here the Rambam says that Midame includes memory and imagination. You'll see in a moment why he links the two. Meaning Margish is sensory input from the external world. The ability that my soul has to take in observations and data from the external world through taste, through touch, through hearing, through smelling, seeing, and the like. Once you take that information in, however, there's a separate koach of the neshama that can remember and draw upon that sensory input, even when that sensory input does not exist, and that is the very valuable faculty of memory. But then the Rambam says, from memory, we can then move into imagination. Now what imagination does is, imagination, the Rambam says, is the ability to combine discrete memories that originate from sensory input into various images and pictures that were never directly seen, but they are a combination of things, right? In other words, this is a very interesting point, which I guess maybe it's obvious and maybe it's not, and maybe people might disagree with it. And that is, the Rambam says, all imagination is ultimately rooted in some type of sensory perception, but it simply involves combining different sensory perceptions to create images that perhaps you never actually perceived. So the Rambam actually gives an example of a flying ship. Now the Rambam wrote this before there were airplanes, but a person might imagine a ship that is flying in the air. Now, you can't directly connect that to memory because he never saw a ship flying in the air. But he saw ships and he saw birds. So the image of the bird in the air and the ship, right? So therefore all imagination is the combining of sensory images. And therefore ultimately imagination draws on some sense of memory. Now memory can be conscious or subconscious. That's also true. But ultimately there has to be some memory that feeds the imaginative capacity within a person. Yeah.
Yeah. So is imagination like related to creativity, or does the Rambam say that creativity is a separate thing that comes from something else?
Well, it will come from something else, but there's no question imagination is connected to creativity, meaning imagination is one of the tools that other parts of the soul will draw upon to create. Now, often in Musar, the imagination is often denigrated. Sometimes it's praised and it's often denigrated. They say you live in a fantasy world. You live in a olam hadimyon. That's a very, very common phrase in Sifrei Musar. You're not focusing on reality. So in a sense, imagination can be dangerous in the sense that I create a fantasy existence and I'm not really paying attention to the realities of life. On the other hand, Rav Chaska Levenstein, one of the great Baalei Musar, used to say that a good Baal Musar is supposed to have a very powerful memory, a powerful imagination, because you're supposed to visualize Yetzias Mitzrayim. What was it like to be a slave? Visualize Kriyas Yamsuf, visualize Matan Torah, because that makes it a much more powerful experience to you. And the more vivid your imagination, right? A good actor does that. I mean, lahavdil, many have told us. This is method acting, right? What is method acting? Method acting is you really imagine, right? Sometimes directors get impatient with method actors because they got to spend like 10 hours, getting themselves in the mood. The director wants to shoot a scene. He says, I need hours to get into this. But basically, method acting, which is a very powerful way of acting, is to put yourself in the emotional reality of that experience. And that is primarily the imagination. In many ways, empathy, midos, empathy, which is a beautiful, beautiful quality in which I bear your burden. That's called nosei bi'ol es chaveira. part of how we have empathy for people is we imagine putting ourselves in their situation. In other words, what would it be like to be poor? What would it be like to be sick? What would it be like to be lonely and not have friends? And that generates in turn rachamim, mercy, in your heart, primarily by use of the koach of midameh, the koach of imagination, that can put yourself in a reality that you did not directly experience. But the Rambam says it has to be somehow connected to sensory inputs, meaning if you never saw a poor person in your life, you would have no way of imagining yourself in that situation. So, in a sense, imagination has to intersect with sensory input. So again, the term for sensory input is margish, that which takes in, feeling not emotional feeling, but physical responses, and midameh. So far I've mentioned three. We have zan, we have margish, we have midameh. Now we come to number 4. By the way, midameh is interesting. Do animals have, right? Zan and margish are absolutely shared in common with animals, although the soul is a different soul. What about midameh? Do animals have imagination? That's a tricky question because there are obviously certain types of imagination that animals will not have. Animals are not going to write Shakespeare or anything of that nature. But if imagination means combining different sensory inputs and then create a mental picture, it could very well be that animals might also be capable of putting 2 and 2 together to create a 4 and therefore respond to a given situation, even though they never confronted a 4. In fact, that's actually a sign of relatively high order intelligence. The crows that you see outside, very, very smart birds. They do that all the time. They figure out how to use a stick and how to do all of these different things to get at whatever food they're doing. Essentially, that's using a description of imagination in which I see this and I see this, and my mind can put it together in a picture of the two things operating together, and then I could figure out what to do. So in a sense, animals have that and intelligent animals do have that form of imagination as well. Yeah.
I'm trying to understand. Is the Rambam saying that like anyone who has 2 pictures has the ability to put them together, or the idea of imagination is the ability to take pictures of things that you have?
No, so remember, the Rambam says midameh, okay, yeah, I should emphasize that again. The Rambam says midameh has 2 components. There is memory and integration of the memories. So memory is I can retrieve the 2 pictures. Imagination is then I can integrate them into something new. You're correct. I mean, if you're missing the memory side, you're not going to be able to start because you don't have the images to put together. So it's a combination. So the Rambam is kolel in midameh 2 things. It's really 2 components: memory and imagination, the ability to put things together, even in ways that you've never seen, and even in ways that might even be impossible. You could imagine flying horses, because I've seen birds and I've seen horses, so I can imagine a flying horse, and the like. Although there is a guy, I don't remember his name, kind of an eccentric professor at Princeton. I don't know if he's still alive. He had a whole theory, like many science fiction people, of infinite universes. And his claim was anything that is capable of being imagined must, by definition, exist in some parallel universe. I have to admit, I'm not sure I see what the logical necessity of that is, but that is his position. And therefore, if you can imagine a flying horse, there must be some universe in which horses can fly, because otherwise you would not have the capacity of imagination. So I just want to point out, although I don't think this professor would be that interested, that apparently the Rambam disagrees with that thesis, because the Rambam says beferish here. And maybe he's addressing it precisely because maybe some people made that argument. Could be that the Rambam is addressing that the Rambam says imagination can combine images to create phenomena that cannot exist in nature, because you're simply taking different pictures and you're bringing them together. So the fact that you can imagine it does not mean that it must actually exist. Even that which is impossible to exist can still be imagined through that combination. Okay, yeah.
I mean, like, also like at the same time, like what the Rambam thought at his time was impossible, we're seeing now is possible. So isn't it to some extent like there should be like no limit on it, I guess, no?
Well, that's correct. I mean, obviously, when the Rambam gave the example of a flying ship, obviously we have flying ships, we have airplanes, whatever it would be. So what was impossible then is actually possible. But the question becomes, does that correlate to imagination? Meaning, yeah, technology advances, but does that mean whatever you can imagine by definition can exist? It's not really clear. Okay, now the fourth one is really the engine that drives everything, and that is called the misorer. The misorer is the arousal of the soul, and that is, this refers to what we might call the actual emotional world a person lives. Certain things repel a person, and certain things attract a person. And in some ways, that's kind of a mystery. What is the source of what we love and what we hate? Right? I mean, some people will see a certain thing and they will get repelled by it. And some people might see the same thing and they will be attracted by it. But in a sense, that is the great motivator of human activity. Now again, it may not affect the zon. The zon is your body is working on its own, whether you like it or not. But it does determine where I put my sensory inputs, where do I look, what do I want to listen to, etc. And it also determines how I activate my imagination. Misorer is human desire. The human desire can either be towards something, or the human desire can be away from something. And that is the source of midos ros. Because when I am repelled by something, I feel hate, I feel anger, I feel resentment. When I'm attracted to something, I can feel love, I can feel longing. Right? So the misorer are the various feelings that push us in one direction or another. Now, we know that Chazal talk a lot about the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. Right? There are desires in us that push us for the bad things, and there are desires that push us to good things. Now, these are urges, but these are urges that are located in the koach of the nefesh that is called the misorer. And this, the Rambam will say, is the part of man that is most amenable to moral education and development. I have urges, I have desires, I have attractions, I have pulls. But the way God made man is I have pulls in different directions. And some of those are violating the will of Hashem, and some of those are fulfilling the will of Hashem. And I can educate myself, I can train myself to direct my will, my desire, my urges in the direction that Hashem wants. And in turn, therefore, the misorer will govern the margish and the medama and the like, because you direct your thoughts, you direct your imagination in proper ways. Okay, so we can call that, generally speaking, misorer is the range of human emotions that find their expression in desiring, craving, or abhorring, and that in turn leads to actions, right? Those thoughts, that hisorerus leads to action, inaction. Because that which I desire, I tend to pursue, and that which I don't desire, I tend to avoid. Here, just as a little aside, I just want to share with you a very beautiful, it's probably a famous thought by now, but I'll tell you a little story about it. There was a woman, she's not alive anymore, she was a reporter, she was a freelance journalist, but she wrote a long article in the early 1980s, maybe even late 1970s, on the Baal Tshuva movement that got published in Rolling Stone magazine, of all places. And what happened was this. What happened was her brother, she came from a secular family in Queens, and her brother became a Baal Tshuva in Eretz Yisrael. In fact, her brother is still a Rebbe in Yeshivat Torah. And she thought this was a cult. She just could not understand why her brother, who was a normal American Jewish guy, got crazy in Israel and somehow, became a Baal Tshuva. So I think Rolling Stone thought maybe there's a drug angle here or a cult angle here. They gave her like unlimited pages. She was able to write like a 25-page story on the Baal Tshuva movement, which is really amazing. They just gave her like unlimited pages. So I remember at the time, I was living in Chicago. All the rabbis wanted to get a copy of this. We wanted to really, this was a major article on the Baal Tshuva movement. But it's a little embarrassing to walk into a 7-Eleven and buy a Rolling Stone magazine. So I remember I waited like 2 o'clock in the morning, Motzei Shabbos, to get a Rolling Stone magazine. Went to 7-Eleven. And of course, one of the students was there that, oh, now I know what you rabbis do Saturday night, Rolling Stone magazine. But anyway, in the story, the woman, Ellen Willis, again, Allah Shalom, not alive anymore, she describes a conversation she had with Rav Noach Weinberg, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, in which Rav Weinberg said, what do you think human beings seek more than anything else? So she said, human beings seek pleasure more than anything else. Now, he did not call her a hedonist. He did not say, oh, how can you say that? He said, you're right, human beings want pleasure. He then said, and what is the opposite of pleasure? So she said, pain. Human beings seek pleasure, and we avoid pain. People may have different definitions of pleasure, but we seek pleasure, we avoid pain, right? The misorer within us says, seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's a basic primal instinct. Rav Weinberg disagreed with that standard definition, which seems almost obvious. He said the opposite of pleasure is not pain. The opposite of pleasure is comfort. So she said she didn't understand that. Pleasure and comfort seem roughly the same thing. And he said no. He says pleasure comes from pain. You work hard to achieve a goal, whether it's getting married, whether it's raising a family, whether it's learning Torah, whether it's building a business even. You get pleasure because you worked hard. Comfort is when you never bother to get out of bed in the first place. So it's comfortable, but it doesn't give you a deep pleasure in life. So he made the point that Judaism is not a comfortable way of life. Judaism is a pleasurable way of life because Judaism involves, indeed, a lot of sacrifices. You can't eat what you want to eat. You can't go where you want to go. There's a lot of things you can't do. So it's not the comfort of having an easy life, but there's a pleasure in the struggle. Right? A person knows this. If you had to, no pain, no gain. It's not only for weightlifting. You know that when you work hard on something, you have a certain deep happiness that you've achieved something. When things just come and go, there's no real pleasure. You're comfortable, but ultimately you get frustrated. So the interesting point is that the misorer of a person seeks pleasure. But it needs to be educated. And we'll talk about how it gets educated. It needs to be educated to understand what is truly pleasurable, what is not. And that is where you have to take what starts off as an instinct and turn it into a conscious choice. Again, you see where the Rambam is going. The Rambam is basically telling us that these are kochos of our nefesh that are largely operating on an unconscious level. But consciously we can direct it, and I'll just mention, and that's the fifth level of the soul, which is seichel. Seichel is intellect. So again, we have the zon, that's the biological soul, or it's part of the soul. We have the margish, which is sensory input. We have the medama, which is memory and imagination. We have the misorer, which are the emotional attractions or revulsions. And then above them all, we have the intellect and the mind. And the intellect and the mind really directs everything. And it can direct, it can train, it can educate your imaginative facilities, it can educate your emotional faculties. And therefore, Pirkei Avos is inputting into your seichel strategies and teachings and learnings that can direct the kochos of your soul. Now, obviously, the Rambam says you can't really direct the zon, although I'll tell you the truth. I mean, lahavdil, there are these Buddhist monks who can control their blood pressure and their heartbeat. So there is, on some level, the mind can be so powerful that you can even control biological processes. But the Rambam isn't going there, okay? The Rambam is kind of assuming, hey, the zon is the zon, take care of your health and etc. But Pirkei Avos is not about maintaining your physical systems. But Pirkei Avos does get involved in using the seichel to educate your misorer, which in turn will determine how your imagination and mind focuses and what you will look at and take in and the like. Okay? So that is the idea of the 5 parts of the soul. Yeah.
Seemingly, this is like the function of the brain, with my very limited knowledge of how the brain works, has a very similar thing in the sense that, what I learned in high school, I guess, is that there's a subconscious part of your brain that sort of controls those things, and there's also the creative part, there's the visual part, there's a sensory outer part that
Yes.
creates our senses.
Yes.
So, where's the difference between this and
Well, yeah. I mean, this is in many ways, Chazal actually say that the soul resides in the brain. So in a sense, what the brain does is not simply electrical, neurological firings, but essentially the soul is using the brain to carry out the different functions of the soul. Meaning the soul is a life force coming from God. It resides in the brain, which enables the brain to coordinate all of the different faculties. Okay? So the only thing is, the soul, see again, an atheist scientist will say that all there is the brain, so when the brain is dead, there is no soul. That's where Judaism would take issue with it. The soul is that which enables the brain to do its job, but when the brain stops existing, there is still the soul, and the soul goes to Shemayim, whatever, yeah.
I know there's some skeptics that will try to say that, in the ancient world, people thought that your soul resided in your heart and not in your brain. And they'll say, they didn't know anything about that. Are you saying that in Shas somewhere it actually says the Moach is like
Absolutely. And I don't think it's in Shas directly, but certainly in Kabbalah, it talks, and the Tanya even quotes us, that the godly soul resides in the Moach, in the brain, yeah.
in Shas?
In Shas, I don't think there's a direct reference to it, but Chazal did recognize that the brain controls the body in many ways, yeah.
Another thing on that, how can something that has no material force whatsoever reside in a place?
Well, that's a great miracle. The Ramah says, in the bracha of Asher Yatzar. So we end, Brechat Hashem, Rofei Kol Basar, right? He heals all flesh, Umafli Lasos, and he does wonders. So what are the wonders that God is doing? So the simple pshat is, the operation of the body is a wondrous thing. But the Ramah says, the wondrous thing is, how can a godly soul reside in a physical body? That's actually called, it's really a nace. Because God is infinite. And if a soul is part of the essence of God, how can the infinity of God be limited and confined to a physical body of any type? So you're right, it really is a miracle. But the Spirit of God animates, gives life. It has Kochos HaNefesh that turn on, so to speak, all of these different faculties, the zon and the margish and the medameh and the misorer and the sichli. Okay, so we'll continue this, but again, this is the Rambam's introduction. This will turn out not to be necessarily so essential to the rest of the work. This is the kind of just an introduction to the notion that the kochos of your nefesh exist in potential, but the seichel can direct and educate them in the directions they need to go. So there's a potentiality that needs to be actualized in various ways. Okay.